As storytellers, we believe in applying what we learned. So today we're going to be demonstrating for you, and we're going to be demonstrating something that we have used in the past, which is Jill Chaimberlain's nutshell technique. Now, we have printed out the free copy of a blank version of her comedy version of the nutshell technique. She has a tragedy, which she goes by Aristotle and his aspects or his definitions of comedy and tragedy, where if there is a generally happy ending, it's a comedy, sad ending, tragedy. So it does not necessarily mean that a story is comedic in nature, just for laughs. But today we're going to be, as the title suggests, looking at Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. This is the second in the most recent trilogy of the franchise, of the Planet of the Apes franchise, and it's one of my favorite trilogies as of late. So we are going to be going through each and every one of these steps and using what we know from Dawn of the Planet of the Apes to map this out according to this specific kind of guideline as to how to break down a script or a story and not necessarily have it be your 3-act structure or your beats or something like that. So we're going to be doing this for this specific film, and before we get started, for context, Jill, she has a really cool thing. We will put the link to her website in the description so that you can sign up for her newsletter. You can get this thing for free without having to get the book, which we have right there, by the way. Nice book, really cool. So what we need to figure out today is obviously, this is based off of your protagonist. So they have their flaw, right? The thing they start off with at the beginning of the story that they have to overcome. And then that turns into their strength at the end of the story. And in between, you need to figure out a setup want. And this is something that the protagonist will say in their first scene or emphasize in their first scene, according to her. And then that will come back later as well. And then there's a point of no return, which is about 25% into the story, where the character actually gets their setup want or seemingly gets their setup want. And this is always followed by what the next thing we have to figure out is, and it's the catch, which is they get the thing they want, but there is a catch to that. And that is always in tandem with the point of no return where they do get what they want. So those things go together. Usually the catch comes right after that point of no return at the 25% mark. And then 75% of the way in, that's right, she kind of skips over a midpoint, which is an interesting way of doing things. 75% into the story, you get you get a crisis, and this is again one of the things we have to figure out today. But the crisis is what she calls the direct opposite of the setup want. So once we find out, or once we figure out what Caesar, who is the protagonist of this movie, obviously, when we find out what his setup want is, when we come to our crisis, it should, according to her, be the exact opposite of the setup want. Thank you, Dougie. And then that's at the 75% point in the story, in the film. And then after that, you have your climactic choice, which is the first big step that the character makes, going away from their flaw and towards that strength. And then your last thing is the final step, and that is the definitive nail in the coffin, another step that the character takes, going away from their setup or their flaw and towards that strength. So those are the beats we're going to, or aspects of story that we're going to be figuring out today for this specific film, and we will have those on the screen so you don't have to, it will be visual for you. But that's what we're going to be figuring out today, and let's get started. So the first thing we are going to figure out is not going to be our character's flaw. That is something that, if you read the book, she talks about. You can find this a bit later on in the story, as you are kind of figuring out where you want your character to end up. you can look at the strength that you want them to have in the end, and then you can kind of reverse engineer and find your flaw. So we're not going to start with the flaw just yet. We are going to start with our character's setup want. So, like I said before, this is usually, according to her, said or emphasized in the character's first scene. So our protagonist for this story is Caesar, and in his first scene, we have the apes on a hunting. They're doing some hunting for food, and so what ends up happening is Caesar's son is on this hunting trip, and Caesar sees evidence of a bear, and so he tells his son to not leave his side, which of course the son leaves his side, and thus the bear comes and attacks his son, and Caesar has to defend him while Koba comes in for the final blow to the bear. What she says in the book is usually it is said in the story. If it's not said, it is emphasized by the character's actions. So when you look at this specific scene, what Caesar is doing is, one, he is getting food for his family, for the apes as a whole, which he considers his family. And two, he is taking care of his son, or at least he is trying to take care of his son. So those two things lead us to believe that his setup want is to keep his family safe or to protect his family, which is, very noble thing, very simple thing to write down in that box. So now that we know that, we can see what happens in our point of no return. Well, our point of no return, 25% into the film, we have the apes showing up at the humans' settlement, which that is the point of no return because up until that point, only a few of the humans know about the apes. And so what Caesar does is, in response to Koba saying they have to make a showing of strength, Caesar decides to have the apes show up at the human settlement and say, hey, you guys stay where you're at, we'll stay where we're at, we're all good. However, if you want to fight, we totally will fight. So this is the point of no return because instead of just 4 people knowing about the apes, now the entire community knows about the apes. And that is the catch that comes along with the point of no return. So you can see how the point of no return and the catch are usually in tandem, and they work this way in this story as well, where now the humans are in a state of panic, causing Gary Oldman's character to be forced into making a decision about getting the power and about fighting the apes. So that's what you can see from our setup want, our point of no return, and our catch, and that incites our flaw in our character. So now, knowing 3 of those elements, we can see that the flaw is that Caesar wants for the apes to be isolated, to be cut off from the rest of the world, including the humans. And so that is kind of his flaw. He wants them to stay separate, and that is what we are going to be putting into that specific box. Now that we have those first 4 elements, we can move on to our crisis. Now, in the book, you will find out, and obviously if you look at this sheet, which you can get for free, it says the setup want is the direct opposite of the crisis. So we know our setup want, which is for Caesar to protect his family, the apes, to protect his people. Now he has to go against his people. So how do the storytellers make that happen naturally? Well, over the course of that second act, Koba turns into the villain of this story. And by the time we get to the crisis, Koba has shot Caesar and taken the apes and basically become their new leader and led them against the humans. And now they have much of the humans in either dead or captured, and Caesar is very badly wounded, and our good humans are now with Caesar and help kind of nurse him back to health with some medicine. And so now Caesar is by himself and isolated, like he is, or according to his flaw, right, he is isolated in that manner. So the only way that he can move forward positively in this story is to start getting people around him, right? Start building a community. So this crisis is Caesar is injured and he is now having to go against Koba and his people. One of the things that the storytellers do very well is they make sure to use the idea that the apes will follow the strongest ape as their leader. So yes, he can build this new community of people around him to help him get there, but he also has to be the one to fight Koba for leadership over the apes, which is great storytelling and making sure that your character, your main character, is the one who is determining the outcome in the end. So now that we know our crisis, we move on to our climactic choice, which is the first major step that our main character takes in our third act away from their flaw and towards their strength. Now, when you think of flaw and strength, right, those are kind of opposites. So in order for us to know our strength, we can kind of see where the character has to go. Yes, you can do the whole figure out the flaw thing first, and since we have isolationism as his flaw, you can kind of guess where we're going. But the idea is to use the story to tell you where that strength will be and what that strength will be. So if he is isolated at his lowest moment, then at his highest moment, he must have a family, right? He must have a group of people around him and have a community. Caesar's climactic choice is his enlisting the aid of the humans in getting him to Koba and the rest of the apes alive, obviously. So when we look at our character's flaw, Caesar's flaw initially is isolationism, and we take him to his lowest moment where he is completely isolated. The only place he can go is to a state of community and gathering people around him to help him out. The storytellers do a great job of forcing this by having him be injured as well, so he can't just physically do everything that he wants to do. So his first climactic choice is enlisting the humans in his fight against his brother, right? Koba, who was there in the first movie and has been there throughout this movie, is now the villain, and so Caesar having to go against his initial setup want, which is to take care of his people and actively fight his people, right? Arguably, the person who has kind of been there, one of the two apes who was with him the longest in Koba, this is really forcing him to make that very difficult decision. So our climactic choice is to go against the apes and to be on the same side as the humans. And then our final step, which Jill Chaimberlain says that it must be the confirmation of the climactic choice, in that, like, the confirmation that that was the correct idea of going away from your flaw and towards your character's strength. That is showing the rest of the apes that Koba was wrong. And yes, it is a fight sequence, but at the same time, it is more along the lines of a fight of ideologies, where Caesar now has the understanding of isolationism is wrong, and Koba is still trying to hold on to that idea that the apes should be separate from everybody else and that they should not help the humans and not, in fact, go as far as to imprison them, right? So Koba is still hanging on to what Caesar's original flaw was, and that's the isolationism, and Caesar has to show him and the rest of the apes that that idea is wrong and that the idea of community is, in fact, a better way of living. So that is our final step that Caesar takes, and that rounds out our entire nutshell technique form for this movie, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. We have our flaw, our strength, and how they are opposites. We have our setup want, our point of no return, where he gets that setup want, and then the catch that comes along with it. We have our crisis, we have our climactic choice, and then our final step that our character takes in this story. And so now I hope that you can see how this specific method of mapping out a story can help you understand other stories better. And then once you look at another story, you can see how your story can take those ideas and can take inspiration, and you can see how, oh, I need to make sure that my point of no return gives me the catch, right? That catch really is what carries you through that second act. And so if you don't have a strong catch there, then your second act can suffer, because that is like your engine, that's kind of the gas that keeps your engine going, right? So just making sure that everything in your nutshell technique and the things in your story work together instead of kind of working individually to tell a better story is always going to make sure it's always going to be a better story if everything works together as opposed to individually. So that was the nutshell technique for Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I hope that you learned about how specifically to use this technique to understand films and potentially understand your own. And as always, keep writing.